All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipovich Show is my good friend Kevin Gosztola. Kevin is a journalist who writes the Dissenter blog at Firedog Lake, which you can find at dissenter.firedoglake.com. He also is the host of a new podcast, co-hosting it with Rania Kalek. You can also find that at the Dissenter blog. You can also follow him on Twitter at kgostola. Kevin, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me back.
All right, so Kevin, you are currently in Chicago, Illinois, which is where you live, but you're there actually covering the trial of the NATO 3. You actually were there earlier today. If people aren't familiar, let's just begin. Who are the NATO 3 and why exactly are they on trial?
We have three young men, Brian Jacob Church, Jared Chase, and Brent Betterly. And these are people who came up from Florida. They were hanging around Occupy Miami and had organized with Occupy Miami. And in 2012, going back to late April, early May, they traveled up to the city of Chicago because there was going to be a NATO meeting. And dignitaries from the world, some military leaders, I think, were getting together to talk about the future of the U.S. military presence or occupation in Afghanistan. And they were here for a large demonstration that was going to be held. There were multiple protests in the lead up to that demonstration.
There's also the G8, theoretically going to be the G8 there at the time as well, which had actually got moved as well.
They would have already known that the G8 was going to be moved, but it's important that that's raised because there are some aspects of the case that are it accentuates some of what the police department was doing. The fact that they thought the NATO meeting and G8 was going to happen at the same time. The main protest was going to happen on Sunday, May 18th. We were going to have the NATO meeting on the 19th and 20th. On May 16th, we had these three men, along with six other people, arrested in a preemptive police raid on an apartment in Chicago. And they disappeared for actually about 18, 19 hours, and then lawyers managed to locate them, and six people were released. Three ended up being charged with terrorism charges, material support for terrorism, and then there was a sensational criminal complaint released by the state prosecutor suggesting that they had been making Molotov cocktails, had been planning to launch attacks on police stations, had been planning to maybe attack the Obama re-election campaign headquarters here in Chicago. And so right before we were about to have this NATO meeting, and Chicagoans have they were told for the past couple months that they needed to fear black bloc anarchists or people who were coming in and might do property damage and et cetera. And now you had some faces to put on that threat.
It's also something a lot of people I think correctly say that was also something to also maybe intimidate people from coming out and protesting NATO, and actually try to, as a way of even like the way, not even just the arrest itself, but the way that the press release was told about these people were a way of saying, well, maybe you shouldn't come down to protest because there might be these horrible people who might try to throw Molotov cocktails at you while you're down there, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I know from covering it at the time, I was here in Chicago covering NATO summit protests, and I actually managed to talk to some of the people who were released from the jail that evening, and I heard from the lawyers, and one of the things they said was that this material in this, initially in this sensational criminal complaint, they weren't advised. Nobody in the state attorney office or any of the police suggested these clients, we believe your clients were involved in this sort of activity or planning these attacks. So now we fast forward to this trial, and the other thing I need to get out here, it's critical to the case, is that there were two undercover cops involved. They went by the names of Bow and Gloves, and their full names are Officer Nadia Chico, and then another guy, Officer Mehmet Egan. He's Turkish. And they were people who somehow I don't think it's unintentional or that they just serendipitously managed to meet the NATO 3, but on May 1st they managed to meet Brian Church, and then they were, from that point on, working First Church mostly for 3 days. They were walking through, and we heard in the courtroom talk of like how they went down and they were walking around the Chase Bank building, and apparently Church was talking to them about what he planned to do to the Chase Bank building, what he could do. Some of it's rather crazy, like it's just goofy, like claiming that he could touch the glass and he would be able to know how thick it was, and that would give him some idea of what he needed to do to like break it, or I don't know. Some of it's kind of crazy and hard to take seriously. And then they eventually did get a court order on May 4th, and they were, by that time, for the rest of the time that they were a part of this group going around and going to these protests and following these three men, they had a wire. They each have their own wire device and were recording conversations. So we've heard those recordings in the courtroom. And I guess what makes this a national story, why it's important to think about this in terms of the whole continental United States, is that the police department had this wide, massive surveillance operation that they were engaged in. And the undercover cops, really, when you follow what they're telling you, you realize that they came to the NATO 3 after doing this untargeted, suspicionless surveillance operation of going to different parts of the activist communities here in Chicago and tracking down anarchists or so-called black bloc anarchists.
Let's pause there real quick, because one of the things that came out in the trial, we have a lot of listeners in Chicago, and most people know that I lived in Chicago. One of the places that they apparently targeted was the Heartland Cafe. And all Chicagoans who are lefties know the Heartland. It is like the most hippie place you're going to find. I regularly performed at the Heartland Cafe. Like it's like it is so. Just this, I mean, they're not. I mean, again, not that there's. I don't think there's anything wrong with anarchists or people who identify as anarchists, but like it is clearly just like a granola area, and I'm like friends with the owner, and so I can say that with knowing the owner as a friend, that like they were targeting this ridiculous, just like little hippie cafe, and supposedly monitoring people from this place. Which again, I found that really just it's scary, but also pretty funny.
Yeah, they put apparently six-person surveillance team on this cafe at one point. So yeah, seriously, they were taking it. And they just were listening to conversations, eavesdropping on these little lefties talking over their vegetarian meals, I guess. And they apparently have no problem with this either. You know, the defense confronted and said, so police just go in. And Nadia says back, well, we were there, we'd go in, we'd observe, listen, and report back any criminal activity. This was the refrain consistently given. It makes no logical sense at all, because theoretically you should just have police officers eavesdropping on people in grocery stores, seeing if they're talking about going to murder their loved ones or whatever, and then they can go preemptively stop that person from committing those crimes. But they were targeting, and they were specifically looking for violent anarchists, and this is their wild theory. The violent anarchists were known to infiltrate peaceful protesters or peaceful organizations, is what they had said. And it's crazy. I mean, and actually, it's the same theory that's used to justify the suspicionless surveillance of Muslim communities, the idea that they are going to allow alleged terrorists, to just lurk amongst them in mosques. And so that's how they justify dispensing agents to basically infest and overrun those religious centers. So here in Chicago, you had crazy things happening in the run-up. Now, we have, Division Street, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they were talking about how they went up and down Division Street with a bunch of officers just trying to, snuff out anarchist graffiti and find anarchists. Somehow they thought they were just like anarchists up and down Division Street.